Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Time-traveling Derek here today. This is a unique little special edition of The Plunge, a 2-episode conversation with one of my good friends and a frequent contributor to The Plunge, Professor Jordan Daniel Wood. I can't wait to see what you think of this conversation. I was privileged to be in Nashville, Tennessee in late February and was able to get together with Jordan for a few hours and discuss a paper that he recently wrote entitled The End of Trauma, the Patristic Doctrine of Deification and Trauma Theory. It's a heady conversation, as most are with Jordan, but I think it's incredibly appropriate and applicable to every listener's life. In this conversation, Jordan and I explore 4 main concepts and how they come together in the person and nature of Jesus Christ. Those 4 concepts are time, trauma, incarnation, and deification. I promise you won't be disappointed. And if you are familiar with Jordan at all, you already know that. But a little bit about Jordan for those of you who have yet to encounter his wit, his intellect, and his heart. Jordan is an assistant professor of theology at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. He holds an MA from St. Louis University and a Ph.D. from Boston College. Both are in historical theology. His interests range from Greek patristic theology to modern philosophy, especially idealism. He's married to Alexis, a registered nurse, and together they have 4 beautiful children, who I had the privilege of meeting during my visit to Nashville. I couldn't be happier to once again bring Jordan Daniel Wood to The Plunge. I thank you for listening, and I thank Jordan for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Awesome. Jordan Daniel Wood, Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you too.
How are things now? We're in Nashville.
Yep.
Our last get-together was at a studio in St. Louis, and now we're in Nashville. How's the move been?
It's been very good. I was most, apprehensive about how my daughters would transition, and that has gone very well. So I feel like that makes everything else much better.
Yeah.
And then the other notable thing is that I have an office.
Very helpful.
Which I was so excited about. So that's a big difference. Yeah, instead of having to rely on that home office where the kids are busting down the door while I'm trying to pretend like I'm working. So yeah,
I will say, those who have seen you on episodes of The Plunge as well as many other podcasts, we will miss the screen behind you.
So
Did you bring that
have
with
that?
you?
I brought it with me, and I still have it, and it's in my room. So,
okay.
If I ever do a podcast thing and I don't feel like going in my office because it's a good 45 minutes away, you will still see the screen.
Okay,
it will appear.
How old are the girls now?
We got 10, 8, 5, almost 6 in a few weeks, and then 3.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're all in school at various levels, but yeah,
they're adorable. I had the privilege of meeting them in person this past weekend, and just the sweetest girls, man. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, and they were really giving you guys a run for your money with the questions they were raising.
They were, and they were not going to stop.
Now you got a little taste of what it's like at home for me.
Yeah. Daddy, what about this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's so fun. Now you're at Belmont University, and what are you teaching this semester?
This semester we've got 4 classes. Well, I got 3 classes, and then one of them is 2 sections. But one is the kind of their core program. It's called Junior Cornerstone. I teach a course called God, the Human, and the Cosmos. So it's a lot of like sort of
God, the Human, and the Cosmos.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So the idea is that you can't really think about one without thinking about the other 2, even if you don't think you're thinking about those other 2. So we look at a bunch of ancient like creation myths and origin stories and walk all the way up to like some modern science stuff and different attempts to put those 3 together.
Interesting.
So that's kind of it's just one of those courses where you're going to get the whole student body because they have to fill the credit. So I'm trying to make it fun and like different than what they probably expected. Then I'm teaching a course for mainly majors and minors in the religion department, or what's called the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, and it's just called Christian Doctrine. So it's kind of an intro to Christian theology, and I'm peppering in all kinds of different things built around 5 big questions in the Christian tradition. So that one is really fun. And then they put me in this semester. The new one for me is a course just called Understanding the Bible. The whole Bible.
The whole thing.
Understanding
Not the
it.
New Testament. Or
No, it's the whole thing. And it's a freshman course. One of the courses they can take on a kind of mandatory core track. But actually, they've been very engaged too. So it's those are the classes.
Is it just the one semester to understand the Bible?
Just once. You got one semester to understand the Bible. If you can't after that, you're just out of luck. Sort of like you've grown out of, Aristotle's threshold for like you're too old to change.
Yeah.
It's one semester.
Well, I wish them the best. I wish you the best. I've spent many years trying to understand it. So
exactly.
Yeah. How goes the Maximus Letters project?
Yeah, that's been the big thing, and the short answer is actually it's going pretty well considering. I expected that the first year at kind of a new academic post, which is a huge blessing. I mean, I hadn't expected that at all. I wasn't really looking at all, and it just thanks to God came by me. But you do know that the first year you're basically doing a lot of new preps. You're trying to kind of keep up with all the new things that you're acclimating to. So, but I have been able to work in some time. And so one interesting thing about Belmont is that the spring semester ends like well before May.
Okay.
Because they have something called Maymester, and it's like a lot of study abroads and stuff. So, but that for people like me, that means, you get basically 2.5 months between years, so school years. I really am confident that this summer that will wrap up.
Nice.
So I think I'm close enough and within striking distance that I think that project will be done in about 3 months.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yep. So
have there been any profound new discoveries in your translating?
And this could be, I don't know how to interpret this, whether it's a sign of bias or what, but one of the things that I've been glad to see is that the way that I had been understanding Maximus, it's holding up across the corpus.
Yeah, good.
So
good.
I don't know if that's a surprise or not, but it's a delightful find. I feel like he is still thinking the way that I had suspected. I mean, I had read some of these letters prior, for my book and back at the dissertation phase and everything. It's kind of why I decided to translate them. But you don't. It's a different thing to translate something requires sort of a attentiveness to the text that you don't get if you're just reading them really quickly in Greek or in a translation like in French or whatever. And so I have been glad to see that he really does seem to think very, very consistently along the lines that I had suspected. I think one notable surprise in a way I had known about, but I hadn't really knew just how strong his language was about. Was there's a certain, I think probably the beating heart of the collection's 49 letters. There are 4 or 5 Christological letters, what they're called. So it's like his most extensive meditations on Christ, and they haven't been translated into English. So that was like my initial in was like, well, this guy is probably one of the greatest thinkers in Christology, I think, in history, and yet his longest and most extensive treatment of the topic is not available in translations. But in one of those letters, he's talking about Cyril of Alexandria used this as expression, one incarnate nature of the word, or one, there's different formulas, but it's kind of one that was posed against Chalcedon's one person in two natures. And so I bring it up because what's striking is that usually what you would expect from someone like Maximus who's defending and trying to explain Chalcedon is he usually will read like the contrary position if it's a counter authority like Cyril in a way that's like resonant with, it's like he gives an interpretation that will match Chalcedon's way. But what he does in this letter is he actually ends up saying, he does a little bit of that, but then he ends up saying that that Christians ought to confess and say Chalcedon's formula, but should also say Cyril's formula, which is like, like the Coptic tradition right now still holds to this, and he says you should say them both at the same time, like they're equally necessary.
Interesting.
And so that kind of thing, like there've been like a Coptic priest that's been very interested in that. So like certain other people were like, wow, there's some interesting potential here. So that I would say that was one kind of like, I didn't realize just how strong he was on that.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Maximus, kind of what time period was he, and what is he most known for?
He is a Greek lay monk, which means he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a bishop, he didn't have any kind of official leadership in the church, but his dates are he's born 586 AD, and then dies in 662. 580 to 662. And so he's, 6th, 7th century thinker. He's most known for his insistence, like he's embroiled in these later Christological controversies in the last part of what's called the Patristic era, like year 100 through 700. And he insisted on Christ having two wills. So the human and the divine will. There's a whole backstory to all that, but he eventually gets tortured at the command or the order of the emperor. And so his right hand was cut off when he was 80 years old. His tongue was ripped out of his mouth when he's 80 years old, and he dies 2 years later from the aftermath. Then, just to kind of put a cherry on top of that story, 19 years after his death, an ecumenical council comes together and sides with him. And so his teaching or his understanding of Christ or his doctrine and what he was kind of defending and insisting on just speaking about, all of his detractors wanted him to do is shut up. They didn't necessarily say
not much has changed.
Yeah, they didn't really want, because of course at the time politics and religion, I mean, all these things are sort of wedded. You can't
sure.
Really, but so they just want him to kind of stop, which is kind of an amazing thing. I mean, an old guy who has no official position was still so highly regarded that he would even get the attention of hierarchs in the church and then politicians at the top of the empire, wanting him just to be quiet, and he wouldn't do it. But anyway, later on, the church, 2 decades after his death, there actually ends up siding with him. It becomes doctrine of the church.
Fascinating. And this controversy, what are its implications?
Wow. Yeah, because it doesn't sound like, it can sound like one of these weird in the weeds, almost like proto-scholastic arguments that doesn't have any kind of, there's no point to it. I think if I could do like the quickest version, I would say, he thought that if you deny that, for example, Christ had a human will.
Okay.
If you deny that, then you are essentially denying that he had a human nature. Because if somebody is a nature, by the way, is just what something is. I always tell my students, nature is the answer to the question what, person is the answer to the question who. So if what somebody is also the way in which they can act, like it determines your capacities, your abilities, and what you can and can't do. If you say Jesus was a human being, but that he lacked human will, then for Maximus it sounds like you're saying he wasn't fully a human being. He didn't have the full capacity of a human. But then, of course, the other side of that as well. But then if you say he has like a human will, and that felt more existential, like you can think of the Garden of Gethsemane or something, not my will but your will be done.
Right.
Then it sounded to a lot of people that were worried about that kind of thing, like you're introducing like an existential struggle at the very heart of Christ, almost like Christ was divided from within. And so they wanted to deny that there were two wills, but Maximus wants to say no, there is one. And what I think this ultimately does, actually, though, is it puts still more emphasis on the fact that the unity or the oneness of Christ happens as his person. There's no other way that these two things are one. And so it really foregrounds the personal, and it highlights the kind of dynamism of a self-conscious subject, like a being, as kind of this realm, or I don't know what you want to say, dimension or aspect of a human life that that can do things or allow things that when we're just thinking very abstractly about divine nature, human nature, created, uncreated, eternal, temporal, sounds like these things can't go together. So, of course, that'll relate to our discussion. But in the realm of the personal, and then you can extend that to the interpersonal, or what you might just call the spiritual, that these things are can be synthesized in a way that we could not have anticipated by our minds. Mm-hmm. And so I think and I don't think that's actually usually appreciated. Most people, it's like if you read a quick history of Christianity, it's like, oh, and then they started arguing about this, and then there's another argument, and sort of Maximus is like, he comes in at the tail end of this, and it's like, oh yeah, so they're sort of like dotting the I's and crossing the T's. He's just sort of saying, yeah, if Jesus has two natures, it also means he has to have two wills, because those are proper capacities of those natures. Mm-hmm. But I think the better thing to see is that he can only maintain these dualities between two natures, two activities was another phase of the argument, and then two wills. He can only maintain the dualities because he has a different conception of the identity.
I see.
And you can't do one without the other.
He being Jesus.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the way in which Christ makes, say, creator and creature or God in the world one is not the way in which it seems possible for them to be when you're thinking of them as two. Mm-hmm. So he has to be able to be one in a way that allows for us to confess that he's two in a different way, but the two does not cancel the one. So like that's I don't know how else to,
yeah.
So I think that aspect has much bigger implications than just like this weird detailed rabbit trail they ran off on arguing with each other.
Yeah. Wow. We're just getting started. So this conversation is prompted by, in part, things we discussed when last we met. Mm-hmm. And I came up with the concept of asking the question if Jesus is the multiverse. and by that meaning the pathway, the throughway, the vehicle, I don't know what no terminology actually fully captures it, but the being by which no aspect of time or space is inaccessible. Mm-hmm. And the consequences of that, mm-hmm. ultimately. Mm-hmm. And you wrote a paper. I don't know. Has it been published?
Not yet. It actually, okay. I just heard it won't be. It's a book of collected essays that won't appear till next year.
Okay. But the paper is our anchor point for this conversation, and you, I think, had a conversation with Chris Green about this not too long ago.
Yep.
On his Substack, and I do not have it in front of me. Do you recall the title of the paper?
Yeah. It's called, let's see if I get it right. It's called The End of Trauma. The End of Trauma. And then the subtitle is, trauma, something like, the doctrine of, the Patristic doctrine of deification and trauma theory. Okay. I was asked to write it for a volume that's going to be called Catholic Theology and Trauma Theory.
Interesting.
But they wanted someone to write an essay from the like some historical period.
Yeah.
So they have like a history section. So this is what I produced.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think it's fascinating. It's phenomenal, in my opinion, like everything that comes through you to us.
Especially my kids.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Obviously, at the top. The End of Trauma is a very provocative title. In its own right. And as we dive into this conversation, I am certain there are listeners, you and I, have experienced trauma, have participated in it, have perhaps traumatized people ourselves, either unwittingly or even intentionally. And at the root of what this conversation is about are four components. And I've structured the questions. We'll see if we stick to them or not, but with first asking sort of a concept of what is time, then trauma itself, then the incarnation, and then deification. So that's the sequence that we're going to progress through. Everybody ready? Good. So I'm going to start with the first question, if that's okay with you. It's a quote from Soren Kierkegaard that is the preface to your paper. And it says this: when God forgets sin, forgetting is the opposite of creating. For to create means to bring forth out of nothing, and to forget is to return it to nothing. Now, that expression probably evokes lots of thoughts for many people in different ways. The question that rose in my mind was the question, because he talks about it coming forth from nothing and returning to nothing, is creation ex nihilo, if I'm saying that right, which was the way I was taught? And if so, how does this manifest in reality? And then if the sin returns by being forgotten to nothing, did it ever really exist? You're welcome.
Oh, wow. Well, so here's the way the stories are normally told. And I think it's true. I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's just the beginning. But
okay.
The story is this. The story is that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or out of nothing, is one that was developed already in the 2nd century, so like the century after the New Testament, but especially by the 3rd and 4th century. And it's kind of like a Christian response to a common idea that, like, when God or the demiurge or some sort of creator or set of creators went to create the world, there was something like prime matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just like sort of this primordial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so God has to contend with it, because when God goes to, as it were, perform the art, right, the act of creating, he has to use the medium or the material substance, which is this, whatever this is. And there's, of course, all these debates and stuff on that. But the point is that there's something already given that God has to work with. And the story then is that the emergence of the doctrine of creation from nothing is Christians rejecting that idea, because everything in the world is nothing but the expression of God's creative will. And so so that's the kind of like origin of the doctrine.
Okay.
When we say everything was created from nothing, we're saying there was nothing there prior from which it was molded or brought about, or God didn't have to work with anything external to him, because there's nothing external to God. Okay, now the issue is that creates for Christians a kind of tension or paradox, because let's just think about the prepositional phrase, from nothing. Okay? From is, like a lot of prepositions are directional.
Mm-hmm.
To, toward, unto, from, out of.
Mm-hmm.
So if there really is nothing in the sense of no thing, then nothing could be from it, because it isn't a place from which you could go, like from a direction, right?
Yeah.
So most of the time what Christians say is, well, okay, yeah, of course there's a danger of thinking that nothing really is something. We're not saying that. All we mean is nothing preceded. Like almost here we're like kind of already messing with like what, in time or what, in sequence. Nothing preceded creation. There was no like time before time. There was not something there that God had to work with. It's just that as a direct result of God's will, like a let there be from Genesis 1, there is. Nothing preceded that. So it's from nothing, not in the sense that it's a real origin, like nothing is there originating with God. Like there's God and there's nothing, and you add them together and you get the world. It's just nothing was there at all that preceded. But then, of course, that immediately throws us to the other side. And someone later, especially like John Scotus Ariugen in the 9th century, he'll talk about this explicitly. He'll say, well, then in that case, and another way to understand nothing is God. Because God is no thing. God is the cause of all things, which means God precedes all things. And so in a way, you can say God is nothing. He is nothing among the things that you know as things. Okay, so then in that sense, though, you can sort of start to talk about from. So that everything that's created from nothing is, in a sense, only from God.
Okay.
So now we're from God, who is the nothing beyond all things, rather than the lack. And so I bring all this up because I think there's just always always was, and it still kind of is, a sort of ambiguity around the idea of from and nothing. So I understand why if you just understand it as like a negation, nothing is like, no, there was nothing there. Okay, that's one thing. But then if you want to think deeper about, well, then what is it? What is the true origin, the source of all things? Then you almost want to say that the nothing must be God. Mm-hmm. Because he's the only thing that's there from which anything could come after.
Yeah.
So at this point, though, then I think to go to Kierkegaard's quote.
Yes.
Now, what we want to say is that creation, if it's truly creation, must be an expression of God's own desire, because nothing came into being except from God's own will, from God. Mm-hmm. But then the problem, of course, is sin and evil and tragedy and trauma and failure, or, as the Christian tradition sums it all up at once, the fall. Because surely, in a sense, that is, or was, or always is, like it's existing, it's real. On the other hand, we wouldn't want to say, well, at least most people don't want to say that, like, the fall or sin is something God wills. Right. And that would mean God is the author of evil. Right. Which is to say God would be also evil and therefore not all good. So we don't want to say that. But then what do we want to say? I'm just saying this because it automatically introduces a kind of ambiguous ambiguity around the status of the is of sin, like the existence it's being. Because on the one hand, if I don't want to say it's all an illusion, right? Because people's trauma is actually real, and like sin really happens, and it really affects people, etc. But when I keep saying really, 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 on the other hand, I don't think the reality is an expression of God's will, because God doesn't will sin or evil. He opposes it and overcomes it. Right. So now I'm left with, well, what is this thing that's both real, but it does not have the source of its reality in God's will? So this is like, so Kierkegaard's sort of, I think, playing with that ambiguity and assuming it in his, in his quotation, but it still kind of moves along the level of a kind of image, right? Yeah. The image is simple. Yeah, yeah. It's everything comes from God, but then very often in the Bible, all throughout the Old Testament stuff, as far as the east is from the west, so far is your sins from me. Like expressions of God's total, generous, gracious forgiveness. Right. Really it's often expressed in terms of God will forget it. Yes. God will not hold it in mind. Mm-hmm. God will put it away. And Kierkegaard's point is, well, if God truly, unless it's just a complete metaphor that's almost misleading because it doesn't mean much, if he really is in some sense going to put it out of his mind in his will, but everything that truly is comes from his mind and will, is that which, is the only thing that precedes creation, then what else would it mean for God to put it out of his mind or his will other than for it to not be? Right. And so that's what he's playing with. Yeah. I don't think he explains how that's possible or what that can, all the dimensions what it could mean. But you see kind of their intuition there is pretty clear. That's fascinating. And so I think that's what he's after.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, my next question is much easier. What is time?
Oh, wow. So, when I was glancing over these, a few things came to mind on this one. So, like, one old classical definition of time, which I still think is kind of useful, is Aristotle said that time is the measure of motion. Okay. That's become sort of newly meaningful, I think, even in modern physics, although, of course, they didn't have in mind what he meant by motion, or vice versa. But you can kind of sense that. Like, try to imagine a world where nothing moves at all. Then is there such a thing as duration in that world? What would be enduring? Sure. Right. From what to what? Through what? Yeah. So you can see a kind of deep intuition, an intuitive link between, unless something's in motion of some kind. Now, Aristotle wasn't just thinking about physics. He was thinking about the motion of the mind. He was thinking about the motion of the heart or whatever, like many different kinds of motions. But the point, whatever you're thinking about, the point is something that moves from one state or point or condition to another and persists through it, undergoes duration. And how you would measure that is what we call time. And whatever units you choose or whatever. I think that's a nice sort of basic conceptual starting point to kind of grasp. And then, as I said, of course, the big modern turn, I mean, skipping over the whole history of stuff, and I'm not qualified to speak about the history of physics or anything, but, the big idea now is to add to that. Like I was just reading recently this book by Roberto Unger and Lee Smolin, who one's a philosopher and the other one's a physicist. And they're sort of emphasizing, as a lot of people do post-Einstein, the relativity of time. Mm-hmm. But not only is time the measure of motion in the classical sense, but also motions are only carried out and perceived from particular relative points, the point of the observer. And then how something appears, how one measures the phenomena that sort of one is subjecting to the categories of time or trying to see or map out according to units of time, that duration is just as relative to the onlooker or the observer or measurer as it is a feature. It's not like an inherent feature of the thing in motion.
Sure.
We could go through all those examples, right, in terms of physics and astronomy and observing the early universe and all that stuff. But so you kind of see that. Now, I think though eventually, what I want to get to eventually, maybe jumping over many steps, is to say, still all of that doesn't quite get to like what I would say a proper theological understanding of time. Here I would just state this and then maybe we can explore it more. I kind of think time, to be a little cheeky here, time is like this space for spirit to embrace its own destiny. Now I say spirit because I do want to distinguish it from sheer physics, but then also I want to capture the importance of the person. But then also on top of that, it's clear that, like say in the Gospel of John, Jesus says only from flesh comes flesh, from spirit comes spirit. God is spirit in chapter 4, which in that context he's talking about, right? It's the woman at the well, and they're talking about space. Because she says, well, we worship here.
Right.
You all worship over there. So that's here and there are spatial terms.
Yes.
And he says, well, God is spirit, and there's a time coming where it will neither be here nor there, but you will worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, typically people take that as like, kind of what it sounds like, which is like a statement about just ritual and where you do it and where it's carried out. I want to say there's a deeper way to read this, which is worshiping God in spirit and truth is nothing else than the deification of creation, the sacrifice or the offering of all things back to God, so that, as Maximus says, we receive from God to be gods.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, what Jesus is saying in chapter 4 about space, I want to apply to time, of course, because they're inseparable.
Sure.
And so, what I'd want to say eventually is that not only will there come a time where we worship in spirit and truth that's not confined to space, but nor would it be confined to a time. And so in that sense, coming to worship God in spirit and truth and giving the world back to God in a state of deification rather than simply conforming to its status as created, inferior, subject to finite measurements like space-time, you hand it back through spirit, through the Romans 8, children of God, the sons of God, daughters of God to be revealed, all creation groans and waits. That act would be us becoming able to choose and embrace our own origin, which is also our own end, which is the very thing that in our finite conditions we don't think we can do because we're thrown into the world at a certain time and place completely apart from our desire, will, or assent or decision. And so most of the time we assume if you absolutize our measurements of time as if they're kind of the entire measurement of the creation and the way it ought to progress, then you're always only ever reacting to or presupposing a given. The given is the conditions within which you came into being. It's almost like a microcosm form of that macrocosmic point about ex nihilo.
Right.
That God has to work with something pre-given. And that kind of seems like maybe God didn't have to do that, as it were, at the start or on the level of like God bringing the conditions for creation out of nothing. But it sort of does seem like we have to do that. We're thrown into the world that's pre-given, and you basically have no say in how you start, where you start from, and then therefore it'll dictate where you end.
Right.
But I think the spiritual rebirth, the being born from above, born again, spoken of in John 2, or 2 chapters before the discussion with the woman at the well, makes it possible for us to be adopted in Christ, to be adopted, which is to say, undergo a process which doesn't seem biological, but it makes you no less the children of God. Fully spiritual, because from spirit comes spirit.
Right.
But being fully spiritual means not being fully subject to the conditions of space, time, and finitude of pre-given, because the pre-given, something that's given before my own desire, means it's not a product of my desire at all. But when we choose, for example, to be baptized, you're choosing your own birth. And I think the Christian life is just a continuation of that until Christ is born through us and in us. And so anyway, that's where you would go if you were going to go to more of a theological interpretation of time. And so in that sense, I would no longer reduce it simply to a motion, or a measure of motion, or even a relative, sort of more interesting relative relational structure of motions and motions in relation to one another. But ultimately, God, it's a mark of God's invitation to us to become truly spiritual, truly persons.
Yeah. Would it be fair, my intuition in conjunction to what you just articulated, going back to Maximus's idea of the two wills, would it be fair to say that our pre-given is one will that is not ours, and our choosing to be baptized to be fully spirit is there any connection there to the two will concept?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it even gets more. It even maybe gets more paradoxical, because in Christ, God willed not just the world, but willed the incarnation.
Yeah.
But that's that. So one thing we can usually do with God is we can say, well, look, there's the world, there's creation out there. And then when you talk about God foreknowing, or God's predestining, or God willing, it feels like you're speaking about one subject, God, and then the world or creation out here. But in the incarnation, the very thing that God foreknows is God's Son. It's God himself.
Yes. God
himself as foreknown by God.
Yes.
So in this sense, Christ's divine will, shared with the Father and Spirit, foreknows and wills Christ himself as willed, as the object of God's will, but not just that he has a human will, but that he enacts the human will as himself.
Yeah.
So in a sense, to put it really probably too hastily and maybe too dramatically, I don't know, maybe not, it's like the structure of God knowing his own incarnation is the structure of self-consciousness. He knows himself both as subject, the knower, and the thing known. He can only be a thing known, partially at least. There's the Trinity, the discussion, but because he is human, he's an object that can be known in history. Yeah. And so God knows himself not only as the knower, but as the thing known, and then as the thing that enacting the harmony of the two wills, divine and human. It's that, I would just call that the life of Christ. Yeah. That very life is the wedding together of the human will and the divine will, the uncreated will and the created will, in one single wedded life. Yeah. And so that is how I would start to, and so what that allows, so Maximus, one of his favorite phrases is that our true birth, which I would just say is our true creation, is becoming, what does he say? He likes to say we're born by the Spirit according to Christ, which is a very kind of stilted way.
According to Christ.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think
in the type of what?
So I think he's picking up a few different things. One thing he's picking up is, again, the sort of time-bending thing is that, and I know we're kind of spilling over into incarnation now, but is that, Paul says in Romans that Adam was a type of Christ. Usually we think of that the other way around.
Because of chronology.
Exactly.
For us.
We assume, again, the pre-given.
Yes.
We assume Adam is, whatever you think Adam is prior.
Yes.
And then we say, and Jesus is like an instance of Adam. And that's because what? Because we fell, God needed to do something. It was a reaction to the fall of Adam and Eve, whatever, But really what Paul says is the opposite. Paul says that when God creates Adam, he's already doing it with Christ in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So that Christ is prior.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is the given, not Adam. So again, we're getting into the time bending thing, like what is truly first? Colossians says that Christ should have preeminence in all things, and I would say, why not in time itself?
Yeah.
But all to say, I think when Maximus says that we are born in the Spirit or by the Spirit according to Christ, it's like we're made according to the image of God, but the image of God is Christ, the image of the invisible God. So even Adam wasn't sort of the prototype, but he himself was already made with an eye to Christ, who is the true image. And so why this is relevant, I think, to this conversation is that if Christ, who is both eternal and temporal, he's both uncreated and created, if he himself is also then the unity of those two, then he makes possible a different kind of coming into being, which does not seem possible when you're just working with pre-givens according to chronology and sequence.
Yeah. Right.
Because we always think what's given in the beginning of the sequence must therefore endure as a pre-given for everything later in the sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So that chronological priority must be absolute priority.
Yes.
But that's a prejudice.
Uh-huh.
There's nothing that's like means that has to be true.
Right.
And certainly not for God, who isn't bound by the logic of sequence or time. So in that sense, I think it is true to say that in the Incarnation, I know we'll get there more squarely in a minute, but God opens up, as it were, the possibility of an inverted priority or given, or what really is given, which is to say, typically we first think we must exist in order to choose, but in this schema, you choose in order to exist.
Love it. Okay. Boy, I gotta be quicker here.
Sorry.
No.
I think I'm going on and on.
No. Okay, you write in the paper, God's creation of time is not itself bound by time. And my question is there anything inherent to God's nature that precludes the violation of natural laws as we understand them? And for context, this is something I have grappled with. I'm not nearly as sophisticated a thinker as yourself, but I've often just surmised that the things that are described in the New Testament and the Gospels, as well as Acts of the Apostles, and as well as just accounts contemporarily that we call miracles, there's something in me that thinks they may actually have there's a law that they're operating under, we just haven't discovered it. So that's kind of part of what's driving this question with respect to God's ordering everything and time.
Right. No, that's well, and I like the way you phrased the question, because what you said, I think, was as we apprehend them. Mm-hmm. That's really key, because that makes it easier for me to answer, which is to say, no way. There's nothing inherent in God that makes it to where the laws nature's laws as we apprehend them must be absolutized. It kind of what we were just saying is is an example of that. The law of sequence and time and progression. I find it funny. Again, I've already mentioned Unger and Smolin, but like their whole argument in the context of natural philosophy and physics is they think that the laws of nature themselves are historical, which is to say that the laws of nature emerge in a process.
I see.
And can also change.
I see.
Now, I think there's some, I like their ideas and I like their intuitions, but I think there's like other issues that they would have to address if I was going to be persuaded on their terms. But we won't get to that. But the point is, even some other people have no issue, they're not doing this theologically at all. There's nothing about religion. But even they're sensing that it's just an assumption to assume that because the laws of nature as we apprehend them right now are very regular.
That's a good word.
And patterned, and maybe even do so over a long amount of time, that doesn't mean they're absolutely bound to always appear, or even for them, even be in those forms in all times and places across what they call the singular universe. And so I just sort of adding to that from the perspective of theology, I would say, there's no I like the way you formulated it, though. It kind of reminds me of C.S. Lewis on that, the sort of deeper, like the deeper logic of nature as breaking through one. I mean, this is the thing we have to constantly remember is nature and the world as we currently apprehend it is not truly what it is.
Right, right.
And that's right.
Yeah.
And so what we're apprehending, just because we apprehend it doesn't mean it truly is in its fullest sense.
Right.
So perhaps the regularities or the patterns that we perceive right now in process, they might be perfectly legitimate. Obviously, they work empirically, and we can develop technology, and we've made all this progress by sort of hewing very closely to those laws
Mm-hmm.
and in their application. But of course, that's we've only been doing that for a handful of centuries, and that's nothing.
Yeah.
That is absolutely nothing in the grand scale, and certainly not for an eternal God.
Yeah.
So because God is the whole act of creation is not itself governed by the logic or the regularities of spheres or aspects of that creation within itself,
Mm-hmm.
then to me, there's nothing that, in fact, I would even go farther and say we should probably expect
Mm-hmm.
that God's perfecting of creation and certainly in the Incarnation will go beyond what we apprehend as natural laws.
Yeah. The thought comes to me of like the states of water as we know them and perceive them, the solid, liquid, gas. Every school kid is taught this. And now there's a fourth state that's sort of plasma-like. At least it's observable and provable. But it's almost as though what you're describing would be like all that we've ever known is water as a liquid.
Right.
And so we operate under that understanding, and
Yes,
yet there could
right.
be things that happen exogenous to
Yep.
that all of a sudden water is now ice or, yeah,
I mean, a great example of this, right, is just our own self-consciousness.
yeah,
Because a law is something apprehended as a third personal object.
right,
But of course, consciousness or subjectivity is always first personal, and so it can't be captured by a third personal law. Right? So like I think we don't even have to reach very far
right,
to find an example of something that not just doesn't but could not be adequately or fully described by any kind of set of laws, external or described objectively.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly because the subjectivity is not an object.
yeah,
It can become an object
mm-hmm.
as you apprehend it, but you got to understand when you're apprehending yourself as an object, you're forgetting yourself as the subject.
Mm-hmm.
But then unless you really are like deep and reflective, and then you reflect on yourself, reflecting on yourself, then you then at that point you realize that whatever is happening here, which we
Yeah.
all struggle to describe,
right,
and yet we all assume literally every moment of our own life,
mm-hmm.
Can't be reduced to that sort of objectivity of laws or something.
yeah,
Only.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's fun. Okay, just two more on time. You write that God's creation is nothing less than the totality of perfected humanity and perfected world, because to the power of God nothing has either passed or is to come, but even that which is looking for in the future is embraced equally with the present by his all-embracing activity.
Wow, what a sentence.
That's quite a sentence.
Where did I get that?
Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you could say a negative point and a positive point there. Maybe I should have written it more simply. Now that I'm hearing
We
that,
can
I'm like,
edit,
what are we
edit
doing?
the paper in real time.
What a purple sentence that is. Well, I mean, the negative point is just that nothing can really be past God if God is the cause of time. We only say things like before, after, past, future, now, later, sooner, right? Those words are assuming the context of time itself, and kind of like time is measured motion. And if God is the creator or the one source of that very temporality, then nothing that happens within time can actually, as it were, go by God. And so, the famous example that Lewis gives is, if you draw a line on a piece of paper, God is the paper. So it's not as if any point of the line is farther from God, because the paper is equally immediate to all points of the line.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's good.
Otherwise, you're just otherwise, and I think we do this a lot, but we do this a lot because we almost can't help it. I mean, it's like it's not even blameworthy. It's just something we have to do to get a start. We constantly sort of reduce God to a creature in time.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we might say, well, he can sort of go up, like he sort of comes down and like does some actions, and then he sort of like goes up and disappears. So even if we give him the kind of prerogative of vanishing from time and reemerging in time whenever he wants, we still kind of treat it as if anytime he does anything, it must sort of work more or less the way any action does within time. But so the negative point in the sentence you read would just be that it can't be that any event that is passed to you is therefore passed to God.
Mm-hmm.
You just consider certain events behind you or ahead of you because you are in time, and your experience of the world is temporal.
Yes.
And you do structure it and measure it that way.
Yes.
And that makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that to project and impose that structure as an absolute structure, almost like a pre-given,
right.
Back to the ex-nihilo stuff, a pre-given structure that God has to deal with, would just to insert God and to make time sort of God's context rather than God the context of time.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the negative point is just nothing can be passed to God, but that's pretty terrifying actually, because insofar as something like a tragedy is past, would mean that to God it isn't.
Yeah.
So both the joys of life and the tragedies of life are just as immediate to God as anything else.
Yeah.
And so that's the negative point, is that I almost want to intensify the problems that we're going to delve into in a little bit by saying, we might heal, and I believe we do, not inevitably, but sometimes with the passage of time. But that's a kind of luxury God doesn't have.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And so the positive point, though, would be that God's will for creation isn't simply to sort of unfold according to its own meanderings within a vacuum, like a big, massive space that sort of allows for sequences to unfold or progressions, but that God has a will for all time and for every time, for all space and for every space, because all of it, if it's really an expression of nothing but the divine will rather than something prior or whatever, it has to have, in God's own intentionality for creation, it has to have a telos, a perfection, an end. So even in the paper's title, I'm playing with the word end. I'll ultimately go on to say trauma itself will be undone, even past trauma, which we'll get to. But then also the end means purpose.
Yeah.
What's the perfection, right? And so does trauma itself, is there some kind of perfection buried under the traumatic experience or the tragic experience that God intended for that time or that relationship or that place or that event that did not happen because this other thing happened? And I think, yeah. So I'm thinking yes, and so the positive point would be to say, eschatology then is still the affirmation that God has a perfect purpose for all this.
Yes.
That whether or not it's happened yet,
right,
is still an open case for God. It's never a closed case because it's not past him.
Yeah.
So he's still dealing with it, so to speak. Still, right? It's a time word. Still.
Okay, but let's let's discuss the section regarding trauma. I really love that you included a quote from the Tale of Despereaux, and I want to read it. And here we go. There are those hearts, reader, that never mend once they are broken. Or if they do mend, they heal themselves in a crooked and lopsided way, as if sewn together by a careless craftsman. Such was the fate of Chiaroscuro. His heart was broken. Picking up the spoon and placing it on his head, speaking of revenge, these things helped him to put his heart together again, but it was alas put together wrong. And I read that excerpt and nodded along because how often we pick up the spoon, whatever that might be, and speak of revenge, thinking that it is helping us make things right, but it's putting us back together wrong. So my question is just, what is your reaction to it, and how is that connected to trauma?
Well, and I also want to give credit to my kids because we were reading.
That's great.
Kate DiCamillo, I think. She's got all these children's books, and so we were reading The Tale of Despereaux aloud. We'd like to do that as a family, to read it aloud. And when we came across this passage, I was in the middle of writing this essay.
Fascinating.
And so I was like, that is the best description of, you might say, the affect of trauma on the subject of trauma that I'd probably ever heard. It's in this children's story, which isn't surprising to you.
Yeah, no, not at all.
As a lover of George MacDonald,
absolutely,
and as an author yourself of these things. So I love the image there. For one thing, I mean, the name itself, right? His name is Roscuro, is the way that he's normally. This is a rat in the dungeon. I won't get into the whole story, but he's a rat, and he doesn't fit in. The rats are supposed to be kind of nasty and wicked, and they've got these terrible designs and plans, but he doesn't want that. And they also dwell in the darkness. He doesn't want that. He wants to be in the light. It's like he feels like he's not supposed to be a rat or something. Roscuro is his name, but then he there's some traumatic events, and I would call him that, for him, that happen, and this is the aftermath, and from then on he's called chiaroscuro, which I think is great, because chiaroscuro is a term of from painting, which means like you use dark tones in a painting in order to make the light pop more in different ways. And I'm not a painter, so I can't really speak very well on this, but like. It's a technique in order to sort of play with the lighting on a canvas or something like that. But the thing is, you need the contrast in order for the whole to work up. Yeah. And so what's nice is that Roscuro is added on, and it's almost like what's added is the darkness. So now Roscuro becomes chiaroscuro, so in the very name, it's representing or symbolizing what's happening internally to Roscuro, which is he's taking the traumatic experiences and trying to integrate them, assimilate them into his own. In other words, narrate them into his identity. Yes, but in such a way,
so much so that his name changes.
Exactly, his very name changes, and whereas he before wanted the light and had this sort of unrat-like desire, now he embraces it and actually becomes like a caricature of it. And I thought that's a very clear, simple, but powerful picture of what I think trauma does to people in their self-narrations, in their identities, in their attempts to cope with it. What's tough is, as we'll talk about, you don't really have a choice but to deal with it. And that's the thing you sense there that's true. I'm not going to, you can't just get over it, right? We know that now, like maybe once upon a time it's like, oh, well, right. You can sort of just do your job, play your role, forget about it if you're a real whatever you think is the ideal, whatever, a man or something. But really we know now, or we ought to know at least, that that's not actually true. That's an illusion in and of itself. So you have to deal with it, you have to confront it, and you have to do something with it. But the problem is, especially in cases of trauma, which is a very special term, and again, I should say I'm not a trauma theorist. I'm not an expert in this stuff. I did a lot of reading for this essay on it, but from what I understand, at least, it's such a profound experience that it almost feels like the only way to cope with it is to somehow integrate it into who you are. Sure. And that's, I thought, her description of Roscuro's transformation, or disfiguration into chiaroscuro. It's also, by the way, I mean, another way to put this is that it's a very poignant example of what sin really does. It's too easy in theological terms to think of sin as like, oh, you broke God's law, you sort of made God mad or whatever. But the truth is you disfigured yourself. Yes. And you become something that isn't a part of that eternal intention of God for creation or for you. Yeah. And so you become false in a part of yourself, but and then your act of integrating that back in there as it put together crooked. Right. When you try to integrate it, it very easily becomes that you identify yourself with something that you're not or someone you're not. And so now the task of the spiritual life, or of salvation itself ultimately will have to include picking apart, severing, to quote Colossians 3, severing and bearing those parts of you that tend towards the earth. This kind of, the sense of judgment as in the Greek as division, pulling these things apart, disentangling, disambiguating the falseness from the true core, so that the true core, which is Christ, ultimately can come forth. So anyway, that would be where you're going down the line, but that description I just thought was so clear.
So good.
Yeah.
I'm curious if to elaborate on the differences between two trauma theories that you presented, and you wrote, crucial for my purpose is a particular tension between the traditional or Freudian model and the pluralistic model forged in reaction to it.
Yeah, so this was something I encountered very early on. It kind of convinced me to go ahead and agree to write the essay when they invited me to do it, because my initial reaction was just like, why are you asking? I'm not an expert, but I kind of was dabbling around in it and looking around, checking out surveys and stuff, and this really stood out to me, this kind of internal divide to trauma studies. One is sort of the earlier, like you mentioned, the Freudian. It's because Freud studied trauma, and it's in the form of I can't remember the original study now or the year, but it was the end of the 19th century. But he sort of, there's a whole sort of set of theorists that follow Freud, and Freud's main sort of contribution is that there's a lot of focus on the damage, kind of we were just talking about, the damage done by trauma on the subject. And then a lot of this goes to what he would call, of course, the unconscious. And so this is sort of, this is stuff that's repressed or whatever, and you don't know that's there, but it still is dictating kind of how you're reacting to the day-to-day life things or triggers or whatever. And the idea is that the trauma was so devastating that it almost becomes like a new origin for your subjectivity, or at least a co-origin or some sort of, it's just so formative for what you are. And so deformative, exactly. And yet you're incorporating it, so it becomes a part of your form as deform, so it's a very paradoxical thing. And in trauma studies, there's a lot of talk about paradox, and then the difficulty in representing this, whether that's in art or in poetry or in film. And so there's this sense of like you're beholden to this event or set of events, and your entire identity is wrapped up in it, and you can really get the feeling that you can't escape it. And so this is a kind of Freudian, it's a little bit more pessimistic, but in a lot of ways still very illuminating about the dynamics of trauma and its aftermath. Even just the fact of having survived, and these theorists would include everything from direct trauma inflicted upon you to like a car accident, or they would usually use a train accident back with Freud, but a car accident, and like you survive but nobody else does. So the difficulty of having to come to terms with your own survival, and kind of the questions like, why me, and what am I supposed to do now? Right. So there's that model. The other model has sort of pushed or resisted, and they call it the pluralist one, because the Freudian one, in its kind of pessimism, it kind of is just like, it kind of constantly runs up against like, this can't be represented, meaning can't be given to this. The very status of this thing is a seemingly arbitrary accident event, or even if it's a very intentionally inflicted event, still there's the question of why me and not anyone else, or why them and not me. And so there's this sense of like, you'll never make sense of it. But the pluralist model wants to kind of come to the aid, I think, of the victim and reinstate some agency. Okay. And say, well, is the victim of trauma really completely and enduringly victimized? Are they always a passive kind of struggler against this thing? Or do they have some ability to remake, to re-narrate, to re-represent, to take control and ownership over the thing or whatever? So there's a tension there between these two models. I don't think they're necessarily absolutely exclusive or anything, and I'm not sure even everybody involved does either. But they are two different kind of ways to approach it, and they form a kind of polarity that I found interesting, because to me, I'm not an expert in that, but to me, as doing theology and sort of being around these themes, that just to me, a lot of that reads a lot like the situation of sin.
Right.
Where
Sure.
but also of existence and the kind of being thrown in sort of thing that we've already talked about. And so that stood out to me as, on the one hand, you have one model emphasizing the devastation into which you are born, or in the way that affects your identity. The other one, though, wants to emphasize the creative capacity in remaking the agency with which you are also outfitted.
Yes. Yeah.
And these two are, in the context of trauma, it's very hard to see how they can be harmonized, and at the very least they're kind of a deep dynamic tension.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the two,
Yeah. Okay. And that ties to that, what I'm about to ask ties to that idea of survivor being chosen concept. You describe our coming into existence as an awakening, as traumatic in a way that I have not considered. I detect a resonance with an earlier conversation we had on George MacDonald's Lilith as to just making sense of the point of life to begin with. Could it be that this being thrown in this awakening is sort of perpetually haunting us, that we've been chosen and thus we're forever after asking ourselves why? And is there any connection to the experience of coming into existence as a traumatic event that remains with us as we proceed?
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive question, because that also struck out to me, and only sometimes, especially that first model, the Freudian one, that Freud himself actually kind of does spill over into that. He universalizes the traumatic experience on a few occasions as sort of like the very condition of life itself. So that's when he turns to the death drive and the book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But anyway, instead of getting into all that, I would just speak directly. I mean, in a way, it's almost immediately obvious once you think of it that way, because you're like, you begin, even your early years, you don't recall.
Right.
And so our experience of coming into being is very much more like our experience of sort of waking up in a place you don't know, around people you don't know, including yourself who you don't know. And so there's a kind of like, you're in inertia, you're in the inertia of just sheer existence, and you don't know why. And you don't, why at all you are. You don't know why you're beginning, where you're beginning. You therefore have no clue where you're going. And so eventually, unless you sufficiently distract yourself from anything that matters, eventually in life, you're going to ask the question, well, is there a point to any of this?
Right. Sure.
And what you're really asking then is the same question that first model denies to the traumatic survivor, which is, it makes it inevitable. You keep asking, why did this happen? This event, this originary trauma. But then for the exact reason that it seems so arbitrary, external, invasive, like a break, like a rupture.
Right.
Then it wasn't intended by you at all. And so even though you can't, it's an inevitability that you will face it, it almost seems like just as inevitable that you will never be able to give an answer to that.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm like, that sounds, I mean, you don't even have to be like goth or something. I mean, it's not that your life is terrible or something.
Sure.
Always. Although I do think certain, experiences in life will incite these questions in different ways. But it's just like the emergence itself. Even if my parents wanted to have a child, they didn't know who they were getting.
Right.
So I couldn't have been the object of their desire.
Yeah.
Not prior.
In any way.
Right away, okay, if everything is going well and the way it's supposed to, they fall in love with you, when you're born or whatever. But like, I mean, and there's nothing blameworthy in that necessarily. It's like, because I don't even know myself well even now. So
right.
I don't even know what I'm intending when I'm intending myself. So I think there, but that quality is ubiquitous throughout existence. On the one hand, we inevitably want to ask, is there a purpose or meaning to any of this? On the other hand, our very origins, which seem arbitrary, seem to constantly haunt us like a shadow that says, well, whatever meaning you find, it's not like one that you intended.
Yeah.
It's not that you were just sort of thrown into this.
Yeah.
Actual traumas that have to happen to people thereafter just compounds all those.
Sure. Yeah.
Not in either direction. Like, whether I have great fortune, a wonderful life, it's why do I have that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then this person, whatever, they have this terrible set of circumstances. And that's an old problem. I mean, that's the problem of theodicy.
Yeah. That's
right. That's the problem of the book of Job.
Yeah.
That's the problem of what is going on here, and whatever kind of control or overseeing or providence that God has on all this is at a different scale than anything we have. So the question's directed to God.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's a properly theological one as well. And so I thought that was interesting that within the psychology and sort of the this very specific and specialized field of trauma studies, these same fundamental dynamics that I detect in theology, we're repeating.
Yeah. Wow, man, it's there's satisfactory answers or hidden.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Okay, I'm going to ask just two more questions on trauma, and then take a little break. So I want to read. This will be a little bit of a lengthy read from your paper. These are 3 quotes that flow together across a few pages. If memory of evils vanish, it is not because memory of all history vanishes. It's because the evils now remembered will themselves vanish. More, this happens only insofar as our nature becomes Christ, himself the image of God that we all individually and collectively are in truth. And you're drawing there from Colossians 1:15 through 21 and verse 27. Just as originary trauma appears paradoxically unmoored from time's strict sequence, so too does the incarnation of God and the deification of creatures affect an unburdened retroactivity, not in compulsive repetition, but rather than in the unmaking and remaking of all originary traumas. And I think that's speaking to what we've just been discussing with respect to the trauma of being thrown in to existence.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's because it seems like having, let's put it this way: if you are created, then you have to make a start. You have to start. But then if you have to start in order to will or desire anything, then the one thing you can't will or desire is your own start.
Right.
Which means that your conditions or circumstances within which you are born are given to you in a way that's external and, in a sense, maybe in a lot of cases, alienating to your own will and desire for yourself. And so, in a lot of ways, though, I mean, think about if you absolutize our experience of time as sequence, if you think, there's the arrow of time, it only goes one direction, nobody can remake the past, not even God, what's done is done, well, then what's done is done is the pre-given that God must forever contend with, so almost creation out of nothing seems to be a little bit compromised. But there's also then there's always a sense in which you won't be spiritual fully because your very origins had nothing to do with you. And a lot of people at this point in religion and their piety will almost revel in this asymmetry. They'll take it as a sign of true sort of magnifying of God's glory to say, oh yes, it's God who chose, when we are born and why and what circumstances. And of course that's true. But then it's sort of accept the given as a gift. This is very common in theology nowadays. And actually it's very funny because it goes all the way across, I'd say from very conservative or sort of quote unquote orthodox all the way to progressive or liberal theologies. One thing that seemingly everyone agrees on is that if something's given, it must be a gift. But why is that?
Sure.
And what about the one who's born with, in certain circumstances where they don't know they're, you can enumerate
plenty of things that are
plenty of examples
given that
right.
we would not define
exactly,
as gift.
Yeah. Which I like because, in German, gift, the word gift it means poison. So it's it kind of performs the point there. Just something, a gift can be deleterious and terrible or a barrier, an obstacle. And on the level of us becoming fully spiritual, it feels like having had to have been created in a more or less arbitrary, or at least external to you, whole set of finite circumstances, means that yes, you're given the gift of life. That's good. But is it the case that life itself must only be given under the conditions of trauma, you might say, of just brute facticity, that you just got to start, and you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And there's like no reason for one place or the other. And so what I think is that, all things considered, it does seem so. It seems like life itself, as Freud thought, is basically inflicted with the tendency towards death. That everywhere you find life, you will find trauma. That anywhere where you find desire and will, you will find the brute arbitrary given. And that almost like these things are yin and yang, like they go together. I mean, I don't know, they're dark and light, they're chiaroscuro.
Yeah.
You know, you got to have both, the contrast. It's sort of the stuff of life. But what I want to say is, ultimately through the Incarnation, that God, as it were, matches and supersedes the kind of paradox that trauma rightly detects about having an originary event which defines your identity, and yet it's one that isn't you, and so there's this struggle forever. Well, the Incarnation is God making a way, an origin, the Alpha and the Omega, appearing in the middle, so that the true origin does not have to obey the logic of the given, the beginning, the brute given, the beginning, the middle, and then the end as a line. But that the true origin can sort of, as it were, not merely interrupt the line, but emerge within the line, so that the line's logic doesn't become the logic of the whole. If that's the case, then the Incarnation matches and supersedes the funny things about temporality and subjectivity that we elsewhere detect under the sign of the negative, if you will, like under the conditions of tragedy, evil, trauma, difficulty, struggle, neuroses, compulsive repetition. Compulsive, that's unintentional.
Yeah, right.
Repetition, and what this is like a super intentional ability to repeat the true beginning anywhere on the line in time. So now what's open to you is to be born again.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word theosis. 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 Theosis is a word used to describe the transformative process whereby a person's aim is to gain likeness to or union with God. It's a loan word in the English, as it originates in the Greek and has been incorporated into certain lexicons, those primarily being theological, and the tradition brings it to us from the Eastern Orthodox community. Also known as deification or divinization, theosis is a key concept, as I mentioned, in Eastern Orthodox theology. And it's not about becoming God in essence, but rather about sharing in God's divine energies and qualities. Truly, theosis is the ultimate goal of Christian life. And we are to become one with God as Christ became one with flesh. Our goal is to be more like God, as revealed in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So on your journey to theosis, have patience and be long-suffering with yourself. We often do it for others, and we fall short of doing it for ourselves. Theosis is a lifelong journey. And it may even take us until after this life, for we are still alive beyond this temporary existence. Lastly, theosis is often described as having 3 stages. Those stages would be purification, illumination, and deification. And so as you go through the refining process, you are ultimately stripped away of the things that are not of God's kind, not of love's kind, until the full and complete restoration and promise of who you were designed to be comes shining forth in likeness with and union with God. As I've discussed with Jordan Daniel Wood, that the process of The work of Christ is making all things new. That includes me, and it includes you. So, theosis is a great word for today's episode. Thank you, Theosis, for sponsoring today's conversation on The Plunge.